Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Tara East. I'm a YouTuber, a lecturer in creative writing, and the author of the mystery novel Every Time He Dies. Today's video is going to be a slightly different format, as this was initially a lecture on developmental editing, structural editing for fiction novels. Because it is a recorded lecture, there are slides, so that's obviously a bit of a different format for YouTube. If you don't like it, obviously you don't have to watch it, but I did really want to get a video up today, so this is what we're working with. I did want to record this fresh, but I couldn't find the script anywhere on my laptop, so we're just going to go with this original recording because that seems more efficient, and it also means I can get back to doing the structural edit on my own novel. So this is a very timely video. I hope you do enjoy the lecture. If you have any questions after the fact, please drop them in the comment section and I'd be happy to have a chat with you. So in this lecture, I'm going to be talking through what developmental editing is. So developmental editing, it's the same as structural editing or substantive editing, but this is the term that we use more often for fiction narratives. But of course, those other terms, structural and substantive editing, is also appropriate. I'll be talking through the role of the editor, the importance of verisimilitude, so truth-likeness. I'll be talking through a little bit through literary fiction, but I'll be focusing more heavily on the needs of genre fiction. So in the study book where we talk about structural editing, there is a specific page about the editing of fiction narratives. So I speak in there about how the developmental editing of fiction is often focused on the big building blocks of craft. So plot, characterization, setting, mood, theme, the structure of the story, how it's been put together, the order of events. So those are the things you are looking at for both literary and genre fiction, but genre fiction also has its own specific needs. I'll be speaking more closely to that within this lecture. I'll also speak about how marketability fits into developmental editing. So why an editor needs to consider the marketability of a piece and how that would influence their feedback and their suggestions to the author. I'll also talk about good world building. So this is particularly important, again, for genre fiction. And then I will be speaking through my own personal self-editing process. I'll be talking through how I perform a structural edit for my own fiction. So obviously this will be fairly idiosyncratic, but hopefully it'll be useful to any writers who are doing this course. But as an editor, it'll also provide you with some ideas on how you might be able to advise or guide your writing clients as they perform the structural edit based on your feedback. So you've probably noticed that most of the content within this course is focused on the editing of nonfiction material, but there is a really big difference between editing instrumental or instructive writing versus creative writing, which is why I wanted to put this lecture together. So readers of nonfiction could be described as passive recipients, as they want all of the information to be presented to them in a way that is really easy to comprehend and to follow. They want the argument to be fully explained. Fiction readers, conversely, are much more active participants as they are creating meaning from the text that is presented by the author. So in many ways, they're co-creating the story with the author. So when I say fiction, what I'm talking about here is novels, novellas, short stories, plays, poetry, that sort of thing. However, there are narratives that have the same quality of fiction, so things such as autobiography, memoir, and even history in some cases. Where most nonfiction is presented in a linear fashion, as information builds upon what came before it, fiction works can be structured in a number of ways. Sorry, I have my dogs in the room. I might need to kick them out in a minute if they start playing. A fiction narrative can be circular or spiral. It can move back and forward in time. A pivotal event that occurs before chapter 1 could be placed in the middle of the book, which would then change everything as it gives so much more context for the story. The book's structure could be made up of hints and clues, insinuations, and atmosphere. There may be multiple points of view and therefore different voices that appear throughout the work, so a change in voice and style, and the tone and pace could vary wildly between different scenes. Where we might imagine that a narrative is gradually building in intensity until we hit the climax, plot tends to have peaks and valleys. It's not always this steady incline, but I'll talk more about that structure in just a minute. Most importantly, there will be a focus on language and vocabulary. Within fiction narratives, though, most importantly, there will be an intense focus on language and vocabulary. Fictional works, whether they be commercial, genre fiction, or literary fiction, use words to tell a story, to create mood and character and entire worlds. Authors use words to make us care about people and sometimes places that don't actually exist. Fiction really is art. So the way an editor is going to approach the editing of fiction compared to nonfiction is therefore going to be very different. A writer may struggle to see their book at the macro level. They are often so close to their writing that when they go to edit the book, they wind up really focusing on the line level, changing small details such as word choice and sentence structure, or focusing on the emotions that are being conveyed in the scene. So this is the type of work we want to do during, say, a copy edit, but there is really no point in perfecting a scene at the line level if later we realize that entire scene needs to be deleted or majorly rewritten. Developmental editing can feel really overwhelming for the editor or especially for the writer as we are looking at the big issues within the manuscript. So, for example, the antagonist may be fundamentally flawed, and so that character is now going to require a lot more thought and active construction, and every scene in which they appear will need to be revised. Alternatively, there may be multiple scenes that are slow and that serve little to no purpose. These scenes may need to be removed entirely, combined together, so combining multiple scenes together, or they might need to be heavily revised so that they have more complexity, tension, and narrative drive. A developmental edit usually requires a lot of work as we are changing and editing major aspects of the novel. And these changes can, of course, then affect other aspects of the novel. Now, I want to just speak to the editor's role in this scenario. It is the editor's job to help the author achieve their creative intentions. It is not the role of the author to tell the writer what is wrong within the narrative and how to fix it. Instead, you are going to want to make suggestions. Yes, absolutely identify issues, but you are making suggestions to get the writer thinking about this piece or this issue in another way. But it is not your job to fix it. That is the job of the writer to come up with a creative solution. And of course, as the editor, you do not want to be imprinting your own ideas or your own style onto this narrative. The editor is working with both what is being said on the page, but also, and importantly, you're working with what is being insinuated between the lines. So you may be paying attention to the nuances within the work and the connotations that are being created through specific word choice and syntax. So Janet McKenzie provides the following quote from her book, The Editor's Companion, and she's speaking specifically around this exact situation. Suppose the author has written, "She hesitated for a moment, then moved forward." You might think to change this to, "She hesitated for a moment, then she moved forward." But in the author's version, the full stop after moment forces the reader to pause, thus enacting the meaning. The emanation eliminates this distinction and flattens the rhythm. So it's really important in prose fiction that the rhythm sounds right, that the sentences sound right. Something you need to be very conscious of as an editor who is working with a fiction writer. Writing is going to be part of that writer's identity. Their decision to share their creative work with you is a very personal and vulnerable act. In these scenarios, the editor should be even more respectful and diplomatic than they would usually be when providing editorial feedback and suggestions. You might like to review Chapter 3 of Janet McKenzie's The Editor's Handbook for additional suggestions and tactics for interacting with authors. Now I'd like to speak a little bit about verisimilitude. The paradox at the heart of fiction is that a story's aim is to show the truth while telling a lie. A story should feel real and believable, even though it is the product of the author's imagination, even though it's entirely made up. The story should also feel emotionally true. And what I mean by that is the characters' responses and reactions should also be believable. If the story is interacting with elements that exist within our world, then these need to be factually correct. So, for instance, weapons need to be described correctly. Buildings should exist in the correct cities and in the correct years. So you shouldn't be mentioning a particular building in 1750 if it wasn't actually built until 1820, for example. Medical information should also be well researched and as correct as possible. There is an element of creative license, and some elements of reality can be bent to serve the greater needs of the narrative. But these decisions will need to be informed by the book's genre, as well as the world building that has been created and how the narrative itself is being executed. So things such as tone and style. Above all else, the author needs to make it clear to the author what they are doing. In general, a book that claims to be set during a particular time and place should follow the conventions of that setting. And fantasy worlds must adhere to the rules that have been created within them. Readers will quickly identify any errors in the work's imaginative integrity. A mistake in either tone or fact can break our suspension of disbelief, and this is the foundation upon which all fiction narratives lie. Verisimilitude basically means truth-likeness. It can occur on large or small scales. So, for example, if a character is boiling an egg and speaking to another character, then this dialogue should only go for a few minutes. External events that can be fact-checked should be accurately represented. So things like historical events, when popular songs were released, world events, cultural trends, that sort of thing. All facts should be checked. If a character is growing a vegetable garden, then the correct plants for the correct season should be present. A military uniform should have the correct number of buttons. The length of time it takes to travel from Manly Beach to Circular Quay in Sydney via ferry should be checked. Now, authors do not always do this fine line level of fact-checking, but it does form part of a developmental edit, because the errors that occur in these instances could actually impact the overall structure, plot, or characterization. Often, these kinds of details are more likely to be handled during a copy edit, but if the error is large enough, then it could absolutely impact the narrative on a larger scale. It's also important to pay attention to concepts, though these can be a little bit more challenging to correct. So, for instance, the idea of progress didn't actually exist until medieval England. Time used to be measured by church bells or the angle of the sun, and green vegetables were thought to be poisonous. Character names should also be believable in terms of location, their age, cultural background, or they should be briefly explained if necessary. Dialogue should have the ring of truth, but with all of the filler words such as well, yeah, nah, removed as a way to keep things tight and really snappy. Dialogue should also reveal information about the character, their education, social status, background, and worldview. A character can speak with a local dialect, but for more information on this, please refer to Chapter 5 of Mackenzie's The Editor's Handbook. Historical fiction, in many ways, is closer to fantasy than any other genre, as the people from different ages are so fundamentally different from contemporary people in terms of speech, values, and lifestyles that you can essentially think of them as being a different species. Continuity is one of the most important aspects an editor can pay attention to here. Emerging or new authors will often revise a manuscript many times, hopefully, ideally, before it arrives at your desk. Therefore, the editor will need to pay attention for continuity in terms of voice and style, but also within the building blocks of the narrative itself, so plot, character, and setting. A wooden house in Chapter 1 may suddenly be turned into a brick house in Chapter 5. Maybe the protagonist's eye color changes from green to blue and then back to green again. Or maybe the layout of the house or the town has changed. These are the sort of details that you will need to pay attention to. When preparing to perform a developmental edit, an editor may need to build several lists to keep track of everything from a family tree, a character list, maps, timelines, floor plans, terminology, etc. Whatever is necessary to determine whether the narrative works. In terms of plotting, pay attention to coincidences and dreams. One or two coincidences may be acceptable, and the plot may depend on a coincidence in order to move forward. However, if there are too many coincidences, then the novel will again lack that ring of truth. It is not the editor's role to fact-check every aspect of the narrative, but you can flag problematic or questionable points for the author so that they are able to double-check these points for themselves. Now I'll be moving more specifically onto genre fiction. So in the study manual for this module, I spoke about the differences between genre fiction and literary fiction, how an editor would generally approach a developmental edit, and I outlined some of the specific ways that genre fiction is different. Now I'd like to go into a little more depth in this video. So one of the key differences between editing genre fiction compared to non-fiction, scholarly work, or even literary fiction is genre conventions, world building, and the primacy of series. Every genre has its own rules and expectations. Horror novels should be unsettling and scary, whether they are suspenseful or gory. Cozy mysteries must have a grisly murder in the opening scenes, followed by baked goods, libraries, and ideally cats. And if a dragon appears in a science fiction novel, which would be out of the norm admittedly, then there had better be a scientific explanation for its existence. A genre editor needs to be aware of these particular conventions so that they know which ones can be broken and which ones need to be kept. Though genre books contain these conventions, it is important that the story feels new and fresh, but without violating the implicit trust of the genre's readership. The crime in a crime novel, for example, should be solved. Romance novels must end with a happily ever after or a happy for now. Science fiction novels must have some kind of technological advancement in it that is based on actual science. Genre editors must be familiar with the genre so that they can identify when the author is reimagining a popular convention or when their narrative is in conversation with well-known texts within the genre. It is also important to think about the actual structure of the story itself. But now I would like to just quickly talk through 7 of the most popular structures for narratives. So we're all very familiar with this pyramid, this particular structure, where we have the introduction, rising action, we hit the climax, and then we have a fall in action. Next, we also have the very popular hero's journey, which you would all be familiar with as well. So you can see here that we also have an Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3 sequence. But within each of those acts, particular plot beats are being hit. Then we have the very popular, and maybe my favorite, the 3-act structure. So you can see how with the 3 acts, again, we have this sort of like valley action. We have a rise to the inciting incident, then we have a dip, another rise to the midpoint, a slight dip again, and then a rise to the climax, and then the fall in action. Next, we have Dan Harmon's story circle. So again, this one is almost broken up into like a pie chart, and we are moving through these specific plot beats. Now, this is also very similar to another popular story structure called the plot embryo. Next, we have the Finchtian curve. So you can see this one's almost like a wave where we have constant valleys, but there is an increase in tension as we dip. It's not like a straight line. We have an increase as we're going up to the climax and then falling action. Now we also have the very popular Save the Cat beat sheet. So for those who aren't familiar, there was a book published called Save the Cat, and it was specifically talking about the plot structure of the most successful films and how these films fit or repeated a very similar structure and pattern. This concept was then taken by Blake Snyder, who then applied the same theory to the writing of a novel. You can see again how there's those peaks and valleys with the catalyst, the midpoint, all is lost. So like the dark night of the soul, a rising action to the final climax, and then dropping down into the final image. The final one I wanted to point out is the 7-point story structure. So again, we've sort of got, interestingly, these valleys, but then we end on a high rather than this sort of falling action. Now, the reason why I wanted to quickly show you these 7 structures is because even though they may seem somewhat formulaic in their basic outline, if you are editing a fiction book for a client and for some reason the story just isn't working and you have a bit of a sense that it could be to do with structure, it may be useful to see what sort of structure it is similar to out of these most popular ones. Because the truth is, we like stories that are somewhat similar or that have this pleasing story arc to them. There is a reason why a story may be unsatisfying, and that reason could be because the story isn't complying with or mirroring with these narrative structures that we have unconsciously developed a preference for. A story does not have to conform to one of these narratives. I'm definitely not saying that. But if the structure of the plot doesn't seem right, it could be worth considering whether the narrative could be reshaped into one of these more familiar, accepted, and pleasing story structures. Now, I'd just like to talk about marketability a little bit. So part of the developmental edit is to assess the book's marketability. So first and foremost, the editor needs to find a book that they love. So most editors will be looking for books that keep them up at night, books that they cannot put down and that they cannot stop thinking about. The types of stories from whom they're going to miss the train or the bus or accidentally burn their toast because they're so caught up in reading. Editors must love the stories that they are representing because they are going to be a champion for this work, and they're going to be working on this book with the author for at least 2 or more years in the lead up to publication. Determining the book's market and its potential audience really comes down to research and assessing what is currently happening in the book publishing industry. So an editor will need to ask themselves, how crowded or mature is the market for this audience? Is there room for a new breakout book in this space? Where does this particular genre look like it will be in another year? What about the year after that? Is this type of book selling like crazy right now, meaning that there may be no interest in this particular type of book in another year or two when this one gets published? Will people still be interested in this type of book 3 years from now when the sequel is released? Or is this trend only just starting to emerge, particularly in the indie author space, and so there could be room for a new author in traditional publishing? The answer to these questions will inform whether or not the editor takes on a book, but it could also inform their suggestions, their particular edits and feedback in terms of plot and characterization as they move through the developmental edit. Now, I'd like to speak a little bit about world building. So world building is particularly important for science fiction and fantasy novels, though it also affects narratives in different genres as well, including speculative fiction, mystery and crime novels, and even romance. World building must serve the story. You don't want the reader to become bored because they are reading page after page of explanation about how this world works, descriptions of the setting, or even a breakdown of the political or religious systems. Additionally, the setting shouldn't require such a great suspension of disbelief that the world is basically laughable. An editor will often work with an author to avoid the dreaded iceberg feeling. So what I mean by that is the author has conducted so much research to construct the world that they are then embedding all of that into the book, and the reader is suffering as a result. So the reader doesn't need to see all of the information that you have learned, everything that you have come across as part of your research. The reader only needs to see the very tip of that iceberg. We need to have a sense, though, of the greater volume beneath, of all of that information. We need to feel as though it's there, but it doesn't need to actually be present on the page. So first reactions are really important. When reading a manuscript, the editor needs to ask themselves, does the world building feel grounded and supported by the story, or is the world building kind of overwhelming the story? Does the story move at the right pace? Not too fast, not too slow? The setting should be intriguing, but it shouldn't distract the reader from the hero or the heroine and their particular difficulties or challenges. Once the world building and setting are solid, the editor then needs to focus on voice, character, and story. These additional elements are particularly important for genre fiction. This is partly because many genre narratives are written as part of a series, which is different to most literary novels, which are really published as standalones. So even romance novels have become serialized now as we move between different potential couples in a social group or within a family. Because series have become so important in genre fiction, it is vital that the characters be engaging. The reader must love or hate them, but they should never be bored by them. If the reader stops caring about a character, then the story is basically over. In her essay, Dukes, Death, and Dragons, Diana Gill provides a case study using Zen Cho's Sorcerer to the Crown. So once this book was under contract with Ace Books in a 3-book deal, Gill was able to begin the editing process. So Zen's manuscript was already actually in really good condition, particularly on the line level, but the book did need some changes in terms of its structure. So the opening chapters, Gill, the editor, said, needed to be sharpened, for instance, and the pace had to be increased. So initially, the story was a little bit slow as it tracked the hero's predicament rather than revealing it through numerous conversations. The story overall really needed to be tightened and the pace had to be increased. So together, the editor and the writer cut out most of the hero's introductory chapter, which was really a lot of preamble. Doing this then allowed the character's actual introduction into the main storyline to be a lot more powerful and impactful. Then they had to work on the character's goals and motivations throughout the story, so that the character was more developed and grounded within the story. So I just wanted to provide that little case study there so you could get a sense of what a real developmental edit looks like in real life with a real editor and with a real book. Now, ideally, a writer will conduct their own thorough developmental edit and copy edit before they ship their manuscript out to agents. While future editors may require the manuscript to undergo further structural or copy editing rounds, it is important that the writer learn how to self-edit their work so that they can make the best impression possible when querying agents and publishing houses. It is important that writers learn how to self-edit their work so that they're able to make the best impression possible when querying agents and publishing houses. Now, I'd like to share a little bit more about my own personal approach to developmental editing. Particularly, I'll be talking through how I did the structural edit for the creative work that I wrote as part of my doctorate in creative writing. Now, to provide a bit of context, I didn't approach the developmental edit of my fiction book until I had completed 5 drafts of the novel. So I wanted to be pretty confident that I was happy with the events in the book. At least I was at the time. So the 5th draft was handed out to beta readers and, of course, to my supervisor and associate supervisor. And in that way, I was able to gather quite a lot of feedback from people who were not as close or as invested in the narrative as I myself was. I read through that initial feedback from my supervisors and beta readers. But then I decided to put that aside for just a minute, and I decided to reread the story and to see what book had I actually written, as opposed to the idealized version in my head. Then I was able to combine these 2 insights that I gained from my own reread and the feedback from my beta readers and supervisors. And then I was able to identify the key structural issues within the narrative. And most importantly, I was able to come up with a plan on how to resolve them. For the sake of this learning experience, I will try to present this in a somewhat linear style. But in reality, the developmental edit was quite a messy process. Rather than working in a clear straight line, it was really much more of a spiral, where I began at a particular point and then drilled down deeper into the work as I asked more questions about what it was I was trying to achieve. Then I would step back, I would brainstorm and conduct further research, and I will speak more to that outline shortly. So this particular novel was really broken up into 3 acts, and it became very obvious during this stage that the 3rd act needed the most revision, as it was where everything came together. It then became obvious what changes needed to happen in Act 1 and Act 2. Basically, I was reverse engineering the plot by starting at the end and then working backwards. So note, I did not write the first 5 drafts in this way, this reverse engineering way. Instead, those first 5 drafts were written from the beginning, moving forward to the end in a way that was much more linear, natural, and intuitive. I could not have done this reverse engineering during the first draft because I didn't know enough about the story. When I wrote that first or second draft in particular, there is no way I could have predicted what the ending was. I really needed to discover that in the act of writing. The issue sometimes, though, with writing intuitively in this way is that those early drafts of a narrative can contain some unresolved loops. They can be overly simple and predictable, and there are absolutely instances of either overwriting or lazy writing. So all of this had to be removed and revised during the developmental edit phase. So I knew from the beginning I had a lot of work to do. So I wanted to re-outline the whole novel as it actually was. And then I outlined what changes I wanted to make for the developmental edit. I basically rewrote the outline. So before I could create that outline, though, that second one, I really needed to get clear on what the book was trying to say and whether or not it was actually saying it. So for a bit of context, the book was dealing with 4 different topics: women, animals, climate change, and the trickster archetype. So I had to figure out how these topics were actually connected and what the book was saying about that connection. In short, I really had to figure out the book's theme. It took a lot of deep thought, a lot of long walks and mind maps, but eventually I did come up with a statement. Now, this statement is never explicitly stated within the book itself, but it really acted as a spine behind the novel. But it really allowed me to decide what details, what plot beats, what descriptions were relevant to the story and what needed to be deleted. Now, once I had this theme firmly cemented in my mind, I wanted to leap into action and I wanted to just start making changes in the manuscript. But I knew that taking that kind of action wouldn't actually be that helpful. Instead, I created that outline for the novel as it currently existed, and from there, I was able to pinpoint any plot holes, as well as opportunities for me to make changes to both Acts 1 and Act 2 in order to rewrite Act 3, if that makes sense. Now, creating this new outline was really important, as it was much easier to see the book in this 6-page outline than as a 350-page Word document. So as part of my feedback and my own self-assessment, I knew that I needed to do more brainstorming around particular plot points and that the world itself needed to be better developed. When we think about world building, most of us think about it in this tokenish way, where the author has gone to painstaking detail to create a visceral alternative world that includes history, political systems, economic systems, environmental factors, and even languages. However, these days, most traditional publishers are contracted to release a novel a year, and many indie authors, at least those who use the rapid release model, release multiple novella-length publications a year. So when you publish at this speed, there is no time to do extensive world building. You cannot dedicate the time to constructing an iceberg when readers are only going to be seeing the tip. So instead, you build as much of the world as necessary to 1, write the story, and 2, create the illusion of an iceberg. So as I was going about this developmental edit and I knew that I needed to fix my plot, I really wanted a strong definition to hold in my mind as I developed this aspect of the world, a really strong definition of what a plot is. And the favorite one that I came to was a character actively pursuing a goal and encountering difficulties. I also held in my mind that a plot is really made up of 4 things: a character, a goal, proactive pursuit, and difficulties. So with these craft basics in mind, my ideas around world building and my ideas around what a plot is, I then did what Cal Newport has now coined productive meditation. So basically, you go for a really long walk without any stimuli and you focus intently on the creative problem you are trying to solve. Now, there have been many articles written about the links between writing, creativity, and walking. During these multiple walks, I generated ideas for how Act 3 should conclude, as well as the story and character arcs for the main characters in Act 1 and Act 2. In short, I brainstormed basic character motivations, so what was motivating my characters, and here is a list of some general motivations: money, fame, sex, power, survival, justice, reward, recognition, happiness, and revenge. These are very common motivations for characters. Then I was able to brainstorm my characters' backstories, potential obstacles for them, plot points, but most importantly, what I did was I asked myself questions about the book. What is at stake? What would make a character do certain things? What does my character want? What are they willing to do to get it? And how does that change the character? What inspires them to change? So this activity is mentally draining as you are challenging yourself to think outside of your normal, lazy, and predictable thought loops. So after this activity was complete, I put away my notebook and I let my mind process all of the ideas that had boiled up from these multiple long walks. The next day, I went out and bought a whole stack of colorful sticky notes. And with the ideas generated from these long walks, I then started to explore all the possible directions I could really take the story in. And I started to consider all of the what-if scenarios that I could look at. So, for example, I considered, what would happen if X died, if Y died? Sorry, my puppy's here. If X and Y had a bad marriage, if X and Y had a good marriage, if X was secretly in love with Z, or if X hated Z. So by brainstorming all of these scenarios, I then followed them through to their sort of natural conclusion. And it just allowed me to see what would happen if I was to make this creative decision. How would this change the novel? Once I'd exhausted this process, I was able to step back and look at all of the sticky notes that filled my office wall. And then I was able to see which plot points, quite visually, I was able to see which plot points were the most interesting and which ones really supported the novel's theme. Then, at last, I opened my Word document and I started rewriting that outline, the outline that was going to govern, that was going to guide my structural edit. And I begun with Act 3 first. So I tried re-outlining Act 3 first, because I knew then where I was heading with the book. And that informed my rewrites, my outlines of Act 1 and Act 2. Because I wanted my revision to be as easy as possible. And the thing is, developmental edits can be a lot of work because you're dealing with these big structural issues. I decided to create a really detailed outline. So I broke it up into my 3 acts. And then within each act, I had sections. And then within each section, I had scenes. And then within those scenes, I broke them down into dot points or into plot beats. So this is what it ended up looking like. So I would have my POV character. I would have part 1. So what was sort of happening in this scene. Then I would identify whatever subplot was happening in the scene, the general gist of the scene, and then every single plot point. So this is how I broke it down. Our POV character is Rebecca. In part 1, we establish Rebecca's goal and introduce her first obstacle. And the subplot that's happening in the scene is marital problems. So in scene 1, Rebecca's digital magazine is losing readers. This is what we're seeing. And she needs to do something to increase traffic to her site. So the first plot beat was Rebecca and Carl are fighting while getting ready for work. When Rebecca receives a notification from her junior assistant, the last report shows a huge drop in the website's traffic. Plot point 2. The emergency meeting is held where the team brainstorms potential solutions, but none are in alignment with Rebecca's work ethic or her vision for the publication. Plot beat 3. Meeting ends and Rebecca calls Catherine, her mentor, for advice. She recommends that Rebecca nominate her digital magazine for an award as a way to generate public interest. Plot beat 4. Rebecca hangs up and sees multiple voicemails from her husband, Carl, and she doesn't listen to them because she's already got enough things to worry about. And now I do want to say that this example is not from my actual story. I'm just providing this here as a bit of an idea, as a way to demonstrate how I broke down these scenes. But you can see in this example that 2 things are really happening. So we have Rebecca, who is fighting to save her career, but she's also fighting to save her marriage. There is a new goal that is being introduced, an award. And so we know that now this is something our character is going to be motivated to go for. So once I mapped out all 3 arcs, I then began to work on my world building. So this process involved a lot of intense research and brainstorming. My novel is set in the future where climate change has resulted in some pretty massive shifts in terms of our ecology. So in order to figure out what was plausible for the future in my book, I needed to figure out what was possible, and that meant doing research into what is happening right now and what scientists are predicting for the future. So I researched things like government policy and all the sectors that climate change affects. So things like agriculture, industry, residential, transport, and electricity, as well as the roll-on effects of climate change. So fires, floods, acidic oceans, a loss of habitat, animal extinction, etc. I looked at these future predictions and potential solutions, and from all of this information, I was able to map out a potential future for my protagonist. Now, this process is fairly idiosyncratic, but again, you need to think about how this approach could be useful if you're writing or editing your own novel, or if you are guiding an author through a developmental edit as their editor. So during this research phase, I filled my wall with sticky notes containing all the information I had discovered, but I also wrote out random ideas for small exchanges between characters and potential plot points that could occur, both of which were actually inspired by the research I conducted. I then went back to my outline and I carefully embedded all of that information as a way to show the world building and as a way to enmesh the world building with the plot itself. So once this outline was complete, I then had the joy of going back into my manuscript and applying all of these changes and following the outline as a guide as I moved through the manuscript. And that's all I've got for you. If you have anything you'd like to comment on or share around how you perform your own structural edit before you hire a professional editor, please leave a comment below because I'd love to have a conversation with you. If you'd like even more writing advice, you can of course check out the other videos on this channel, or you can go to taraeast.com and dive into the archives. While you're there, please consider joining up for my email newsletter. When you do, you'll receive a free gift from me, plus you'll receive newsletters whenever I send them out that will include a letter from me, a quote of the week, some resources that I've recently loved and think you will too, as well as some other tidbits that I only share via email. Right, everyone, thank you so much for watching. I'm gonna get back to writing and editing right now, and I hope you do too, because the world actually does need more books.